Marlowe Broussard had walked through the side door of Broussard Ironworks at 7 every weekday morning for 11 years. Every one of those mornings, her badge had beeped green before she'd even finished her coffee. This Monday, it beeped red. Twice. She tried the front entrance instead, passing the wrought iron gate her father had forged with his own hands the year she was born. Visitors always stopped to photograph it before they stepped inside. The receptionist, Odell, wouldn't meet her eyes. "Miss Marlowe, you're going to want to sit down." She didn't. Marlowe walked straight through the shop floor, past drafting tables where apprentices bent rebar into shapes her father used to sketch on napkins, and past framed newspaper clippings from the 80s, when Broussard Ironwork first started appearing on balconies throughout the Garden District. When she reached her office, the door was already open. Her name was still there on the brass plate, but underneath it, in fresh vinyl lettering, was another name, Malik Reyes, Chief Operating Officer. Her sister Georgia was already inside, arranging papers on the desk as though she'd been expecting this exact moment for weeks. "Before you say anything," Georgia said, "it's not what it looks like." Marlowe stared at the new lettering. "It says Malik's name on my office door. Tell me what else it could look like." Georgia's hands went still over a cream-colored folder. The company needed restructuring. The board approved it. "Everything is legal, Marlowe. The board is you, me, and Malik. I don't remember approving anything. You signed the consent form in March, during the Atlanta trade show." Marlowe had been in Atlanta in March, 300 miles from home, shaking hands with distributors from 6 states and eating cold hotel eggs before sunrise. She hadn't signed a single company document that week. She had left her signing authority with Georgia on purpose. That was their arrangement. It had been their arrangement since their father died, when Georgia had sat her down and said, "You handle the fire. I'll handle the paper." Marlowe asked for a copy of the consent form. Georgia handed it over without hesitation. Somehow, that felt worse than if she'd refused. Their father, Elias Broussard, had built the company out of a single forge behind a shotgun house in the 9th Ward. He had taught Marlowe to read heat in a piece of iron before she could read a full sentence. "Orange means soft," he used to tell her, "and when it turns white, it's telling you to slow down." Georgia had learned the ledgers instead. Invoices, payroll, columns of numbers. A company needed both. When Marlowe was 15 and Georgia was 17, Elias brought home a boy named Malik, whose mother had died in a house fire 2 blocks away. He never made Malik feel like a guest. He gave him chores like everyone else, yelled about his grades like everyone else, put food on his plate without asking whether he planned to stay. But Elias kept a second ledger, separate from the company books. It was a battered leather book with 3 columns ruled by hand, Marlowe's column, Georgia's column, and a third column that remained blank for years. Across the top, Elias had written one sentence in his careful handwriting, "For whoever earns it." Marlowe used to think that line was about money. Now, she wasn't so sure. She still remembered the night Malik arrived. 1 duffel bag, a burn scar along his forearm, and the look of somebody already planning where to run if kindness suddenly changed its mind. Georgia had been the first person to sit beside him. She handed him a plate and let him eat for 20 minutes before asking him a single question. Marlowe used to tease her sister that she'd adopted Malik long before their father made anything official. She hadn't understood then how literally Georgia carried that feeling. Marlowe and her husband, Grant Osmond, had built their own kind of ledger during 4 years of marriage. He handled his companies. She handled hers. Grant was the kind of man who could restructure a supply chain over breakfast without raising his voice. He owned 3 companies, and one of them, Osmond Development, had enough active projects to keep entire vendors alive for years. Broussard Ironworks had supplied decorative steel for 2 Osmond projects before Marlowe and Grant ever married. After their wedding, Grant deliberately moved future bids through independent procurement teams. No favors, no leverage, no billionaire husband quietly turning his wife's company into an extension of his own empire. Marlowe had asked for that boundary. Grant had respected it, even when respecting it clearly hurt. She had seen that restraint before. The year she rejected a supplier Grant believed was overcharging her, he'd picked up his phone, stared at the screen, and then put it back down without making the call. He could have solved the problem in 10 minutes. Instead, he let Marlowe negotiate for 3 days because it was her contract to win or lose. That kind of self-control had not always come naturally to him. On their third date, Grant had told her about sitting outside a hospital room for 6 hours after his mother's stroke, refusing every offer of help from his staff, until a nurse finally told him, gently, that managing something wasn't the same thing as healing it. Grant had told Marlowe the story almost like a warning label. He knew his instinct was to take control. And Marlowe knew that loving her meant learning when not to. She spent that first afternoon in the company's small legal office with Delacroix, the soft-spoken attorney who had drawn up her father's original incorporation papers. He wouldn't review the consent form. He apologized, then explained that his firm had been replaced the previous month on Malik's signature. He could no longer advise anyone connected to Broussard Ironworks without creating a conflict. He said it like a man reading his own eviction notice. Marlowe didn't call Grant from the office, partly because she wanted to handle the problem herself, and partly because some proud corner of her didn't want her billionaire husband watching her lose something her father had spent 40 years building. That night, she sat across from Grant at their kitchen table, turning the consent form over and over as though the words might change if she looked at them long enough. Grant watched her for almost a minute. "Talk to me." It wasn't a demand. It was an offer. "I'm handling it." "I didn't ask if you were handling it." Marlowe finally looked up, and for once, she let him see exactly how frightened she was. Not frightened of losing money. She was frightened for the gate outside the factory with her father's initials worked into the iron. For the 41 employees who called her Miss Marlowe the same way they'd once called him Mr. Elias. For a third column in an old leather ledger that someone had apparently decided they could fill by taking something from her. Grant's expression changed. His voice didn't. "What do you need from me? Help me look. Only look." "Nothing gets decided without me in the room," Grant nodded. "Understood. If you've ever watched something get taken from you by someone who is supposed to protect it too, subscribe and stay with this story, because Marlowe had not yet discovered what her sister had really done, or what Grant would do once she finally asked him to act. 2 days later, Grant brought in Priya Anand, a forensic document examiner who had testified in corporate fraud cases without ever appearing impressed by the people paying her. She spent 4 hours examining the March consent form. Then she laid 3 findings across Marlowe's kitchen table. The ink on the signature line came from a different batch than the ink used on the rest of the page. The date had been altered from an 8 to a 9, faintly visible under angled light. And the notary stamp belonged to an office on Magazine Street that had closed 6 weeks before the form was supposedly signed there. Priya didn't editorialize. She simply pointed, explained, and let the evidence be ugly on its own. Grant said nothing until Priya left. Then he slid a second folder across the table. "I had my general counsel trace what that consent was used for. I didn't authorize anyone to contact the company, the buyer, or the bank." Marlowe opened the folder. The forged consent had not only elevated Malik's authority, it had also been attached to preliminary documents for the sale of 60% of Broussard Ironworks. There was a bridge financing application too. The collateral included company machinery, receivables, and Marlowe's disputed ownership share. Her name appeared 6 times. Her real signature appeared 0. Marlowe went very still. Grant watched her. "Say the word, and every institution relying on those papers gets notice tonight." She closed the folder. "Not yet." His jaw tightened. "Not yet," she repeated. "I want them in the room when it falls apart." Grant gave one slow nod. "Then tell me when." Word moved through the shop floor faster than any memo ever could. By Wednesday, 2 welders had quietly asked Odell whether they should start looking for other work before the busy season ended. Marlowe walked the floor longer than necessary that afternoon. She checked joints she trusted completely. Asked apprentices about measurements she already knew were right. Mostly, she wanted the people who had learned under her father to see her face and decide for themselves whether they believed the rumors. She made no promises she couldn't keep. She simply stayed until the last shift clocked out. That night, Grant found her standing at the kitchen counter with both folders open. "You know what I hate?" she asked. "Several things. Narrow it down." Despite herself, Marlowe smiled. Then the smile disappeared. "I keep trying to find the exact moment Georgia stopped being my sister and became somebody who could do this." Grant leaned against the counter. "Maybe there wasn't one moment? That's worse. Usually is." Marlowe looked at him. You've been very calm. No, I've been very married. What does that mean? It means you told me not to decide anything without you. He paused. So I'm waiting. Marlowe studied him for a long second. Tomorrow is the shareholder meeting. I know. I want you there. His eyes stayed on hers. As your husband? As the man with enough lawyers to make sure nobody pretends they misunderstood me after I finish speaking. For the first time, Grant smiled, not happily. That I can do. Malik ran the shareholder meeting the next morning like he'd been born to it. He presented a proposal to sell 60% of Broussard Ironworks to a conglomerate in Baton Rouge that manufactured decorative railing overseas and shipped it in by the container. The union contracts would be renegotiated. Nearly half the shop floor employees could lose their jobs within a year. Malik called it modernization. He didn't look at Marlowe once. Georgia sat beside him with her hands folded. At the far end of the table, the buyer's representative clicked through projected margins. Grant stood near the doorway behind Marlowe, silent, exactly where she'd asked him to be. Before anyone votes, Marlowe said, I'd like everyone to look at the consent form this entire restructuring is built on. She placed Priya's findings on the table. Different ink, altered date, invalid notary. Then she added the financing documents, then the collateral schedule. The atmosphere in the room changed before anyone spoke. The buyer's representative stopped touching his laptop. Malik's face lost colour. Georgia stared at the forged signature for a long time. Finally, she exhaled. I forged it! Nobody moved. Georgia swallowed. I forged Marlowe's signature. Why? Marlowe asked. Georgia looked at Malik. Because he never got anything. Her voice cracked once, then steadied. Not the ledger. Not the company. Not even Dad's name on his lips the way we had it. I raised him after Mum died right along with you, and every time Dad drew those 3 columns, I watched that boy stand outside a family he was already inside of. Marlowe said nothing. Georgia continued. I thought if I gave him something on paper, it would finally be real for him. I thought I was fixing something. Her eyes finally met Marlowe's. I didn't let myself think about what it would cost you. It wasn't an excuse, and Georgia didn't offer it like one. Malik spoke next. I knew. His boardroom voice was gone. I told myself I didn't, but I knew that form wasn't right the first time I saw it, and I let it stand because I wanted it to be true so badly. I stopped asking questions I already knew the answers to. He turned toward the buyer. Withdraw the offer. There's nothing to sell. The buyer's representative looked at the documents, then at Grant. We'll need to review our remedies. That was when Marlowe turned around. Grant had been waiting for exactly that. She gave him one nod. He stepped forward, not to the head of the table, beside his wife. My legal team sent preservation notices at 8 this morning, Grant said calmly. The lender, the state filing office, your corporate counsel, and every institution that received a document carrying Marlowe Broussard's disputed signature now has the forensic report. The buyer's representative stiffened. For the first time, Georgia looked frightened instead of defensive. Malik's hand flattened against the table. Grant continued. Any transaction based on those papers is frozen pending review, and any attempt to enforce a penalty against Broussard Ironworks using a document you now know may be fraudulent will be answered by my counsel before lunch. Malik stared at him. Georgia did too. Grant's voice never rose. And because Osment Development currently has 2 open procurement reviews involving your parent company, I disclosed the governance issue to our compliance committee this morning. He looked directly at the buyer's representative. I didn't tell them what decision to make. A beat passed. I didn't have to. The man's phone buzzed against the table, then buzzed again. He looked down. His own general counsel was calling. A second notification came from the lender underwriting the transaction. The financing review had been suspended pending an internal fraud assessment. Whatever he read ended the meeting faster than shouting ever could. He closed his laptop. We're withdrawing. Grant sat down beside Marlowe. That was all. He hadn't bought the company out from under them. He hadn't threatened anyone's family. He hadn't used his money to turn Marlowe into a spectator in her own fight. He had simply made sure the lie could no longer hide behind paperwork, procedure, or a buyer eager to close before anyone asked the right question. No threat. No victory speech. Just consequences. Delivered in the same calm voice Marlowe had watched him use in boardrooms for years. For the first time all week, Malik looked less like a man who had been caught, and more like a man who finally understood what his wanting had cost everyone around him. The vote that followed wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The forged restructuring was voided. Marlowe's ownership was restored on record. Georgia re-signed her position as an officer before anyone asked her to. Malik resigned as chief operating officer. Then Marlowe slid her father's old employment handbook across the table. "If you want a place here," she said, "you can earn one." Malik looked at her. "How?" "The same way everyone else does." He started under the union foreman. A 6-month apprenticeship. 6:30 every morning. Steel-toed boots. No executive office. No ownership. No shortcuts. Marlowe didn't hug him. She didn't tell Georgia everything was forgiven. It wasn't. Not yet. Grant waited until they were home before he said anything about the meeting. "You didn't need me in there." Marlowe set down her keys. "I wanted you in there. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. Then she added, "And when I finally asked you to move, you moved. Only where you pointed. That's why I asked." Something in Grant's expression softened. For 4 years, he had proved he could protect her by staying out of her way. That morning, he'd proved he could protect her without taking her place. Months later, Marlowe found Elias's old leather ledger in a drawer she hadn't opened since the funeral. The 3rd column was still there. Malik's name had been written into it in Georgia's careful handwriting. Marlowe didn't cross it out. She picked up a pen and added 4 words underneath. Earned, not given. Her badge worked again the following Monday. It beeped green before she'd finished her coffee, just as it had for 11 years before that one red morning. Marlowe stood at the side door for a second longer than necessary, one hand resting against the iron her father had taught her to understand. Then she went inside. The ledger stayed open on her desk. Some mornings, Malik walked past on his way to the floor and saw it. Some mornings, he didn't look at all. Either way, he kept showing up at 6:30, boots on, ready to earn a place he'd once tried to accept without earning. Georgia came by the shop on Fridays now, not as an officer, not carrying folders, just as a sister who stood near the forge and watched the new welds go up. Marlowe let her stay a little longer each week. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not the same thing as pretending the theft had never happened. And love was not proven by what you were willing to give someone. Sometimes it was proven by what you refused to let them take. If you believe love without honesty eventually becomes betrayal, tell us in the comments what you would have done in Marlowe's place. And subscribe for more emotional stories about family, power, consequences, and the people who finally learn that trust has to be earned.